My parents didn't notice that I moved to another state, but now my father is calling me and demanding that I visit them, or he will stop paying for my college education. So I told him that I already graduated a year ago, and I earned 10 times his income. My name is Sienna, and for the past year, I've been living a life my parents don't even know exists. A life they didn't notice I had started. I moved to another state, changed my number, and built a new world for myself, one where I wasn't invisible. But today, that world collided with the one I left behind. My father called, his voice sharp and demanding, threatening to cut me off financially if I didn't come home for a visit. The irony? I graduated college a year ago. I've been working a job that pays me 10 times what he earns, but he doesn't know that. He doesn't know anything about me anymore. The call came in the middle of a workday. I was sitting in my sleek, minimalist apartment in Seattle, the city I now call home. The rain tapped gently against the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. My phone buzzed, and when I saw the name Dad flash across the screen, my stomach dropped. I hadn't spoken to him in over a year. Sienna, his voice boomed through the phone. No greeting, no small talk. Your mother and I haven't seen you in months. You're coming home this weekend, or I'm cutting you off. No more tuition payments, no more allowance. Do you understand? I froze. My fingers tightened around the phone, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. I hadn't told them I'd moved. I hadn't told them I'd graduated. I hadn't told them anything. And now, here he was, demanding I come home like nothing had changed. Dad, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I don't need your money. I graduated a year ago. I have a job. I'm doing just fine on my own. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then, his voice, colder than I'd ever heard it. What do you mean you graduated? What do you mean you have a job? Growing up, I was always the invisible one. My parents were too busy with their own lives to notice mine. My father, a stern man who valued success above all else, was constantly working. My mother, a socialite who cared more about appearances than emotions, was always at some event or another. I was an afterthought, a footnote in their perfect lives. When I left for college, it was like I disappeared completely. They paid my tuition, sure, but they never called, never visited, never asked how I was doing. So when I graduated, I didn't tell them. I packed up my things, moved to Seattle, and started a new life. A life where I was seen, where I mattered. After the phone call, things escalated quickly. My father started calling incessantly, demanding answers. My mother left tearful voicemails, begging me to come home, but I couldn't. Not after everything. Not after years of being ignored, of being made to feel like I was nothing. I tried to explain. I told them about my job, about my apartment, about the life I'd built for myself, but they didn't want to hear it. All they wanted was for me to come home, to fall back in line, to be the obedient daughter they thought they could control. Finally, I agreed to meet them, not at their house, but at a neutral location, a cafe halfway between Seattle and my hometown. I walked in, my heart racing, and there they were. My father, his face red with anger. My mother, her eyes filled with tears. Sienna, my father, said, his voice low and dangerous. What the hell is going on? You think you can just disappear? You think you can just leave us in the dark? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I didn't disappear, I said. You just stopped looking. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. My mother gasped, and my father's face turned an even deeper shade of red. But I wasn't done. I graduated a year ago. I continued. I have a job. I make 10 times what you do, Dad. I don't need your money. I don't need your approval. I just needed you to care. And you didn't. There was a long silence. Then, my father did something I never expected. He laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but a genuine, almost relieved one. You're just like me, he said, shaking his head. Stubborn, independent, determined. I stared at him, stunned. This wasn't the reaction I'd anticipated. This wasn't the anger, the guilt tripping, the demands. This was acceptance. I didn't notice you were gone, he admitted, his voice softer now. And that's on me. But you've proven you don't need us. And maybe that's what we needed to see. We talked for hours that day about my job, my life, my dreams, about their lives, their regrets, their hopes for the future. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. As I left the cafe, the rain had stopped, and the sun was peeking through the clouds. I felt lighter, freer. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. But as I got into my car, my phone buzzed with a text from my younger brother, Landon. Hey, Sienna, just so you know, Dad's been sick. He didn't want to tell you, but I thought you should know. He's been trying to reach out because, well, he's scared. Scared he's running out of time. I stared at the screen, my heart sinking. All this time, I thought he was trying to control me. But maybe, just maybe, he was trying to hold on. I sat in my car, the engine idling, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Landon's text replayed in my mind like a broken record. Dad's been sick. The words felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I hadn't seen my father in over a year, and now this? Was this why he'd been so insistent on me coming home? Not to control me, but because he was afraid? I didn't know what to feel. Anger, guilt, sadness, all of it swirled inside me. A storm I couldn't calm. I thought about the conversation at the cafe, the way my father had laughed when I told him I didn't need his money. You're just like me, he'd said. At the time, it felt like a victory, like I'd finally proven something to him. But now, those words felt different. They felt like a plea, like he was trying to connect with me in the only way he knew how. I drove back to my apartment in silence, the city lights blurring through my tears. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, staring out at the rain that had started again. My mind raced with questions. How sick was he? Why hadn't he told me? And why did Landon feel the need to be the one to break the news? I thought about calling my brother, but I didn't. Instead, I opened my laptop and started scrolling through old photos. Pictures of family vacations we never really enjoyed. Birthdays where I felt like an afterthought. Holidays where my parents were more focused on appearances than actually being present. I stopped at one photo, a rare, candid shot of my father smiling. It was from my high school graduation. He looked proud, but I remembered how quickly that pride had faded when I chose a college he didn't approve of. I closed the laptop and took a deep breath. I needed to think, to process. But the more I thought, the more conflicted I felt. Part of me wanted to reach out, to be there for him, but another part of me was still angry, still hurt by years of neglect. The next morning, I woke up to another text from Landon. Did you get my message? We need to talk. I hesitated before replying. I got it. I'm thinking. His response came quickly. Don't think too long, Sienna. Time isn't on his side. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix this, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I spent the day at work distracted, my mind constantly drifting back to the conversation with my father and Landon's text. My boss noticed and asked if everything was okay. I lied and said I was fine, but the truth was I wasn't. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step back or jump. That evening, I called Landon. He picked up on the first ring. Hey, he said, his voice cautious. Hey, I replied, my throat tight. Tell me everything. He did. He told me about the diagnosis, the treatments, the way our father had tried to keep it all a secret. He told me how our mother had been struggling to hold everything together, how she'd begged him to reach out to me. He didn't want you to know, Landon said. He didn't want you to feel obligated to come back. But Mom, she thought, you deserve to know. I didn't know what to say. I felt numb, like the world had shifted beneath my feet. Sienna, Landon said softly. He's not the same man you remember. He's scared, and I think he needs you. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I thought about the life I'd built here in Seattle, the independence I'd fought so hard for. I thought about my father, the man who had always been so distant, so unapproachable. And I thought about the time we'd lost, the years we'd wasted. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept circling back to Landon's words. He's scared, and I think he needs you. I didn't know how to reconcile that with the man I'd known my entire life, the man who had always been so cold, so distant. I found myself replaying memories I hadn't thought about in years. The time I fell off my bike and scraped my knee, and he told me to walk it off. The time I won an award in middle school, and he didn't show up to the ceremony because he had a work meeting. The time I told him I wanted to study literature in college, and he scoffed, saying it was a waste of time. But then there were the other memories, the ones I'd buried deep down. The time he stayed up all night helping me with a science project, even though he had an early meeting the next morning. The time he taught me how to drive, his patience surprising me. The time he hugged me after my first breakup, even though he didn't say much. I didn't know which version of him was real, the stern, unapproachable father or the man who, in rare moments, showed glimpses of something softer. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I booked a flight home. The plane ride felt like an eternity. I stared out the window, my mind racing. What would I say to him? How would he react? Would he even want to see me? When I landed, Landon was waiting for me at the airport. He looked older, more tired than I remembered. We hugged, and for a moment, it felt like we were kids again. Thanks for coming, he said as we got into his car. I didn't know what else to do, I admitted. He nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel. It's been hard, Sienna. Mom's been trying to hold it together, but it's a lot. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I was walking into a world I didn't belong in anymore. When we pulled up to the house, my stomach dropped. It looked the same as it always had. Perfectly manicured lawn, pristine white siding, the kind of house that looked like it belonged in a magazine. But it felt different now, like the walls were holding secrets I wasn't ready to face. I took a deep breath and followed Landon inside. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy. My mother was in the kitchen, her back to us as she washed dishes. She turned when she heard us come in, and for a moment she just stared at me. Then she rushed over and pulled me into a hug. Sienna, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so glad you're here. I hugged her back, feeling a lump form in my throat. She looked older too, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with worry. Where is he? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, then nodded toward the living room. He's in there. He doesn't get around much. Anymore? I walked into the living room, my heart pounding, and there he was, my father. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, a blanket draped over his lap. He looked smaller somehow, like the illness had stripped away the larger-than-life presence he'd always had. His eyes were closed, but they fluttered open when he heard me come in. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he smiled, a small, tired smile. Hey, kiddo, he said, his voice soft. I felt the tears well up in my eyes, but I blinked them away. Hey, Dad? He patted the chair next to him. Come sit. We've got a lot to talk about. I sat down, my hands trembling. I didn't know where to start, but he did. I'm sorry, he said, his voice cracking. I'm sorry for everything. And just like that, the walls I'd built around myself started to crumble. His apology hung in the air, heavy and raw. I didn't know how to respond. My father had never been one to apologize, not for anything. And now, here he was, sitting in front of me, his eyes filled with regret. I didn't know how to be the father you needed, he continued, his voice trembling. I thought providing for you was enough. I thought if I worked hard, if I gave you everything you needed, that would be enough. But it wasn't, was it? I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. No, Dad, it wasn't. He nodded, his own eyes glistening. I see that now. I see it in the way you've built your life without me. You're strong, Sienna. Stronger than I ever was. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him that it wasn't too late, that we could fix this, but the words wouldn't come. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on us. Finally, he reached over and took my hand. His grip was weak, but it was enough to break me. I'm proud of you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I ever told you that, but I am. You've done so much, and you did it all on your own. I squeezed his hand, my heart aching. I didn't do it on my own, Dad. I did it because of you, because I wanted to prove to you that I could. He smiled, a sad, tired smile. You don't have to prove anything to me, kiddo. Not anymore. We talked for hours that night about my job, my life in Seattle, the dreams I had for the future. He listened, really listened, in a way he never had before, and for the first time in my life, I felt like he truly saw me. But as the night wore on, I could see the toll it was taking on him. His breathing became labored, his words slower, more deliberate. You should get some rest, I said, standing up. We can talk more tomorrow. He nodded, his eyes already closing. Stay, Sienna, just for a little while longer. So I did. I sat by his side, holding his hand until he fell asleep. When I finally went upstairs to my old room, I felt drained. The walls were still covered in posters and photos from high school, a time capsule of a life I'd left behind. I sat on the bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix this, but I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of voices downstairs. I could hear my mother and Landon talking, their voices hushed but urgent. I got dressed and went downstairs, my heart pounding. What's going on? I asked, my voice trembling. My mother turned to me, her face pale. It's your father. He's not doing well. I felt the blood drain from my face. What do you mean? He had a rough night, Landon said, his voice tight. The doctor's on his way. I rushed to the living room, my heart in my throat. My father was still in his armchair, his breathing shallow, his face pale. Dad, I said, kneeling beside him. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. He opened his eyes, a faint smile on his lips. I know, kiddo. I know. And then just like that, he was gone. The room fell silent, the weight of his absence pressing down on all of us. I knelt there holding his hand, unable to move, unable to breathe. It didn't feel real. None of it felt real. My mother's sobs broke the silence, and Landon rushed to her side, pulling her into a hug. I stayed where I was, staring at my father's face, waiting for him to open his eyes, to say something, anything, but he didn't. The doctor arrived a few minutes later, but it was too late. There was nothing anyone could do. I don't remember much of what happened after that. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls, arrangements, and quiet moments of grief. I felt numb, like I was watching everything from a distance. At some point, Landon found me sitting on the porch, staring out at the backyard. He sat down beside me, his face pale and drawn. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. I shook my head. I don't know. He nodded, staring at the ground. Me neither. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between us. Finally, I turned to him. Did he ever talk about me? I asked, my voice trembling. Landon looked at me, his eyes filled with sadness. All the time, Sienna. He was proud of you. He just didn't know how to tell you. I felt the tears well up in my eyes again, but I didn't try to stop them. I wish I'd known, I whispered. Me too, Landon said, his voice breaking. We sat there for a long time, the silence between us heavy but comforting. For the first time in years, I felt close to my brother, like we were finally on the same page. The days that followed were a whirlwind of arrangements and visitors. Friends and family came by, offering condolences and sharing stories about my father. I listened, but it was hard to reconcile the man they were talking about with the one I'd known. The night before the funeral, I found myself standing in my father's study, staring at the shelves filled with books and photos. There was one photo in particular that caught my eye, a picture of me at my college graduation. I was smiling, my diploma in hand, my cap slightly askew. I didn't even know he had it. I took the photo off the shelf, my hands trembling. On the back, in my father's handwriting, were the words, "My daughter, the graduate, so proud." I felt the tears spill over, my chest tightening with grief and regret. The next day, at the funeral, I stood at the podium, the photo in my hand. I looked out at the sea of faces, my heart pounding. My father and I didn't always see eye to eye, I began, my voice shaking. But in the end, I realized that he loved me in the only way he knew how, and for that, I'm grateful. I held up the photo, my vision blurred with tears. This is how I'll remember him, not as the man who was too busy to notice me, but as the man who was proud proud of me, even if he didn't always know how to show it. The room was silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air. I stepped down from the podium, my legs trembling, and sat down beside Landon. He reached over and took my hand, squeezing it tightly. "He would have been proud of you today," he whispered. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I hope so. After the funeral, the house felt emptier than ever. The quiet was suffocating, a constant reminder of the loss we were all trying to process. My mother spent most of her time in the kitchen, busying herself with tasks that didn't need to be done. Landon and I drifted through the days, unsure of how to fill the space our father had left behind. I stayed longer than I'd planned. A week turned into 2, then 3. I told myself it was because my mother needed me, because Landon needed me. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to leave. I wasn't ready to go back to Seattle and face the life I'd built there. Not when everything here felt so unresolved. One evening, as I was packing up my father's study, I found a box tucked away in the corner of the closet. It was old, the edges worn, and the lid covered in a thin layer of dust. I opened it carefully, my heart pounding. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me. My hands trembled as I picked up the first one. The paper yellowed with age. It was dated the year I left for college. "Dear Sienna," it began. "I know I don't say it often, but I'm proud of you. You're going to do great things, and I can't wait to see where life takes you." I felt the tears well up in my eyes as I read through the rest of the letters. Each one was filled with words he'd never said to me. Words of pride, of love, of regret. There was one from my graduation. "I wish I could have been there to see you walk across that stage. You've worked so hard, and I'm so proud of you." Another from my first job. "I always knew you'd make something of yourself. You're stronger than I ever was." And one from just a few months ago. "I don't know if I'll ever get the chance to tell you this, but I'm sorry. I'm sorry for not being the father you needed. I'm sorry for not saying the things you needed to hear. I hope one day you'll forgive me." I sat there on the floor, the letters scattered around me, and cried. I cried for the father I'd lost, for the time we'd wasted, for the words we'd never said. When Landon found me, he didn't say anything. He just sat down beside me and started reading the letters. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know he wrote these." "Neither did I whispered. We sat there for a long time, reading through the letters, sharing the words our father had never been able to say to us. "He loved us," Landon said finally, his voice breaking. "He just didn't know how to show it." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I know." That night, I called my boss in Seattle and asked for more time off. I wasn't ready to leave yet. There was still so much to do, so much to say. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, life began to find a new rhythm. My mother started to smile again, small and tentative at first, but genuine. Landon and I spent hours going through our father's things, sorting through decades of memories. It was painful, but it was also healing. One afternoon, as we were cleaning out the garage, I found an old box of my things I hadn't seen in years. There were childhood drawings, school projects, and a stack of letters I'd written to my parents when I was away at summer camp. I sat down on the dusty garage floor and started reading through them. They were filled with the kind of innocent enthusiasm only a child could have. Stories about campfires and canoe trips, complaints about the food, and promises to write again soon. At the bottom of the box, I found something that made my heart stop. It was a letter from my father. "Dear Sienna," it began, "I hope you're having fun at camp. I know it's hard being away from home, but I'm so proud of you for being brave. I miss you, and I can't wait to hear all about your adventures when you get back." I stared at the letter, my hands trembling. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. "What's that?" Landon asked, sitting down beside me. I handed him the letter, my throat tight. He read it silently, his expression softening. "He loved you, Sienna," he said finally. "He just didn't know how to show it." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I know." We sat there for a while, the silence between us heavy but comforting. "What are you going to do now?" Landon asked finally. I sighed, staring at the letter in my hands. "I don't know. I can't stay here forever, but I'm not ready to leave yet." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take it one day at a time." I smiled, feeling a small flicker of hope. "Thanks, Landon." That night, I sat down and wrote a letter to my father. I told him everything I'd never been able to say, how much I loved him, how much I missed him, how sorry I was for the time we'd lost. When I was finished, I folded the letter carefully and put it in an envelope. I didn't know where to send it, so I tucked it into the box with his letters to me. It felt like a small step, but it was a step forward. As the weeks passed, I began to feel a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The grief was still there, sharp and raw at times, but it was no longer all-consuming. I started to think about going back to Seattle, about picking up the pieces of the life I'd left behind, but before I could leave, there was one more thing I needed to do. I drove to the cemetery one afternoon, the sun warm on my face. I stood in front of my father's grave, the wind rustling the leaves of the trees overhead. "Hey, Dad," I said softly, my voice trembling. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I need to say this." I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "I'm sorry," I began. "I'm sorry for the time we lost, for the things we never said. I wish I'd known how much you cared. I wish I'd known how to reach out to you." I paused, tears streaming down my face, but I'm also grateful for the time we had, for the moments we shared, even if they were few and far between. And I'm grateful for the lessons you taught me, even if you didn't mean to. I knelt down, placing a single rose on his grave. "I love you, Dad," I whispered, "and I'll carry you with me, always." I stayed there for a long time, the wind whispering through the trees, the sun warm on my back. When I finally stood up, I felt lighter, freer. The next morning, I packed my bags and said goodbye to my mother and Landon. "Are you sure you're ready to go?" my mother asked. asked, her eyes filled with worry. I nodded, hugging her tightly. I think so. I'll come back soon, I promise. Landon walked me to the car, his hands in his pockets. Take care of yourself, Sienna, he said, his voice soft. You too, I replied, hugging him. And thank you for everything. He nodded, his eyes glistening. Anytime. I got into the car and drove away, the sun rising behind me. As I left my hometown behind, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. The drive back to Seattle was long, but it gave me time to think about my father, about my family, about the life I'd built for myself. I thought about the letters, the words he'd never been able to say to me, and the ones I'd never been able to say to him. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex, it felt like coming home. The city skyline was familiar, comforting in its own way. I carried my bags upstairs, the weight of everything I'd been through still heavy on my shoulders. But as I stepped inside my apartment, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in months. Spent the next few days settling back into my routine, catching up on work and reconnecting with friends. It felt good to be back, to be surrounded by the life I'd built for myself, but something had changed. I found myself thinking about my father more often, about the lessons he'd taught me, even if he hadn't meant to. I thought about the letters, the words of pride and love he'd never been able to say to me, and I realized that, in a way, he'd given me the greatest gift of all, the strength to stand on my own. One evening, as I was unpacking the last of my things, I found the box of letters. I sat down on the floor, the letters spread out around me, and read through them again. This time, I didn't cry. Instead, I smiled, because I realized that even though he was gone, my father was still with me. In the lessons he'd taught me, in the strength he'd given me, in the love he'd never been able to say out loud, and that was enough. Life moved forward, as it always does. The grief didn't disappear, but it became a part of me, a quiet ache that I carried with me wherever I went. And in a strange way, it made me stronger. I threw myself into my work, into my friendships, into the life I'd built for myself, but I also made time for the things that mattered, for my family, for the people I loved, for the moments that made life worth living. One weekend, I flew back home to visit my mother and Landon. It was a short trip, but it was enough. We spent the weekend reminiscing, laughing, and sharing stories about my father. It felt good to be together, to remember him in a way that was full of love and gratitude. As I was leaving, my mother handed me a small box. I found this in his study, she said, her voice soft. I thought you might want it. I opened the box carefully, my heart pounding. Inside was a watch, my father's watch. It was old, the leather strap worn and the face scratched, but it was unmistakably his. I felt the tears well up in my eyes as I held it in my hands. Thank you, I whispered, hugging her tightly. She smiled, her eyes glistening. He would have wanted you to have it. I wore the watch on the flight back to Seattle, the weight of it comforting on my wrist. It felt like a connection, a reminder of the man he'd been and the lessons he'd taught me. And as I stepped off the plane, the city skyline stretching out before me, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time, because I realized that even though he was gone, my father was still with me, in the lessons he'd taught me, in the strength he'd given me, in the love he'd never been able to say out loud, and that was enough.